They say the coldest place on Earth is not Antarctica, but the front steps of the home I spent 15 years building. That is where my husband handed me divorce papers while his mother wore a triumphant smirk. They locked me out in the freezing Boston snow, convinced I had lost everything. But they had no idea my quiet smile was not defeat. It was the realization that their own greed just triggered the perfect trap. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now let's begin the story. My name is Haley Morgan and I'm 42 years old. The bitter wind of a Boston winter afternoon howled through the historic streets, driving sharp needles of sleet and snow into my face. I had just returned from another state, exhausted down to my very bones after burying my Aunt Josephine. The flight had been delayed for 6 hours. My clothes were damp, and all I craved was the familiar warmth of the brownstone I had poured my heart and soul into for the past 15 years. I had chosen every piece of furniture in that house. I had painted the walls, restored the hardwood floors, and built a life there. I trudged up the stone steps, my boots slipping slightly on the gathering ice. My fingers stiff and aching from the cold, reached out to punch in the familiar passcode on the electronic lock. A harsh red light blinked. Access denied. Frowning, I wiped the snow from the keypad and tried again. Red light. It was then that I noticed the cardboard boxes. 3 flimsy cartons sat pushed into the dark corner of the porch, already dusted with a thick layer of snow. Through the poorly taped flaps, I could see the fabric of my winter coats, my favorite coffee mug, and a few framed photographs. My personal belongings, tossed outside like unwanted garbage on a freezing afternoon. Before I could even process what I was looking at, the heavy oak door swung open. There stood Julian, my husband of 15 years. He wore a thick cashmere sweater, but he shivered. I suspect it was not from the cold weather. His eyes darted everywhere, focusing on the mailbox, the street lamp, the snow, anywhere but my face. Over his shoulder, stepping out of the warm, amber-lit foyer, was his mother, Victoria. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored wool blazer and a silk scarf, looking as if she were attending a high society gallery opening rather than standing on a freezing porch. Her arms were folded neatly across her chest, and a triumphant, smug half-smile played on her perfectly painted lips. "You are locked out, Haley," Victoria announced. Her voice was as crisp and icy as the winter wind hitting my back. "Do not bother trying the code again. The house was sold this morning. The funds have already been transferred to a secure account to protect our family assets. As of today, you are officially homeless." I stared at her, the biting cold of the wind suddenly feeling dull compared to the freezing reality of her words. Julian shifted his weight nervously from one foot to the other. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, thrusting it awkwardly toward me. His hand trembled so violently that the paper rustled. "Things have just gone too far, Haley," Julian muttered. His voice was weak, pathetic, and entirely devoid of the man I thought I had married. "I cannot do this anymore. I cannot continue this marriage. The divorce papers are inside. I have already signed them." The icy wind whipped around us, tugging violently at my scarf. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation. She was waiting for the breakdown. She wanted the tears, the screaming, the desperate begging of a woman who had just lost her husband, her home, and her financial security in a single afternoon. She had orchestrated this exact moment to watch me crumble. She wanted a spectacular display of my utter defeat. I looked at the 3 of them, Julian cowardly and shrinking into the doorway, Victoria glowing with malicious pride, the boxes of my life quickly becoming buried under the relentless Boston snow. I let my eyes drop to the envelope in Julian's shaking hand, noticing a second document tucked beneath the divorce papers. It was the closing contract for the house. My eyes scanned the visible text, absorbing the absolute reality of their betrayal. The cold no longer bothered me. A strange, crystal clear calm washed over my mind, sharpening my senses. Instead of falling to my freezing knees, I stood perfectly straight. I looked directly into Victoria's expectant eyes. And then I smiled. It was not a smile of hysteria, nor a mask for my pain. It was a quiet, peaceful expression of pure clarity. I did not say a single word. I did not scream. I did not beg. I reached down, calmly adjusted the strap of my leather purse on my shoulder, and turned my back on them. I walked slowly down the icy steps, my head held high, stepping deliberately into the white expanse of the freezing storm. I did not look back. And as I walked away into the winter afternoon, the utter deafening silence I left behind wiped the smug satisfaction entirely off Victoria's face, replacing it with a creeping paranoid confusion. I found refuge in a dimly lit, near-empty coffee shop, 3 blocks away from the property I used to call home. I sat in an isolated booth near the frosted glass window, wrapping my cold, stiff fingers around a large ceramic mug of steaming Earl Grey tea. The radiant heat slowly seeped into my skin, thawing the physical chill of the winter storm, but my mind was entirely consumed busy connecting the fragmented shards of the past 15 years. I thought about my grueling tenure as the chief architect at Viridian Stratos. For well over a decade, I poured the best years of my life into that corporate firm designing high-rises and massive commercial complexes. I worked 60, sometimes 70 hours a week, burning myself out for one singular purpose. Every paycheck, every massive year-end bonus was quietly and dutifully funneled into funding Julian's lofty ambitions of building a groundbreaking technology startup. He was the brilliant visionary he always told me, and I was the solid foundation. That foundation, I eventually learned, was entirely controlled by his mother. Victoria was a master of the velvet-wrapped dagger. Over the long years of our marriage, she never once raised her voice in anger or resorted to vulgar, direct insults. Her psychological manipulation was a terrifying art form always carefully disguised as elegant maternal concern. I recalled a Thanksgiving dinner exactly 5 years ago. Victoria had clinked her expensive crystal wine glass to get everyone's attention and smiled warmly at me across the dining table. "Haley," she had purred in front of all our guests, "it is truly admirable how you sacrifice your femininity and precious family time to work like a common laborer, so my son can pursue his genius. I could never bear to neglect my own husband that way, but you are wonderfully modern." It was always exactly like that. Fake poisonous praise designed specifically to demean me and lower my self-worth, followed immediately by suggestions that she take over our financial planning to ease my heavy burden. She demanded access to our tax returns under the guise of finding us a better accountant. She scrutinized my bank statements, yet she actively encouraged Julian to spend thousands of dollars on luxury items he called necessary business expenses. And Julian let her do it every single time. Whenever I tried to establish healthy boundaries regarding our joint bank accounts or our investment portfolios, Julian would aggressively recoil. He would pace around the living room nervously wringing his hands and recite the exact same rehearsed line. "Mother only wants what is best for our future Haley. She has decades of financial experience. Why must you always be so difficult and ungrateful?" Bit by bit, year by agonizing year, I watched the man I loved dissolve into a spineless, pathetic echo of his mother's demands. He surrendered his autonomy willingly, perfectly content to let Victoria direct not just his failing company, but our entire marriage. Staring down into the dark amber liquid of my tea, the true timeline of their betrayal suddenly crystallized in my mind. Selling a historic Boston brownstone is not an impulsive overnight act. You do not just list a multi-million-dollar property and close the sale on a random Tuesday morning. This cruel exit strategy had been meticulously orchestrated. They had planned this financial ambush for many months, quietly staging the house, secretly negotiating with corporate buyers, and drawing up the complex legal paperwork entirely behind my back. They had simply been waiting for the perfect, uninterrupted opportunity to strike. My Aunt Josephine, falling terminally ill, and my subsequent departure out of state to arrange her hospice care provided them with exactly the lengthy window they desperately needed to liquidate our most valuable marital asset before officially filing for divorce. My thoughts drifted to Aunt Josephine. She was an absolute legend in the corporate world, a ruthless and brilliant negotiator who spent 40 years dominating the fiercely competitive sector of corporate mergers and acquisitions. Even in her final days, frail and permanently confined to a sterile hospital bed, her mind remained as sharp as a diamond cutting glass. I remembered sitting beside her just 2 days ago, gently holding her fragile, trembling hand. She had looked at me with her piercing gray eyes, squeezing my fingers with a surprising, desperate strength. Her voice had been a raspy, fading whisper, but her words were absolute law. "Haley," she had breathed out into the quiet room, "never build a castle on land owned by someone else unless you hold the map to the minefields." I had not fully understood her cryptic warning, then blindingly consumed by my own grief. But sitting in this quiet cafe, having just been discarded like worthless trash in the snow by the family, I financed her final words, echoed with terrifying, brilliant clarity. I reached down and unzipped the hidden inner compartment of my leather purse. My hand brushed past my wallet and closed around a thick, heavy paper envelope. I pulled it out and laid it flat on the wooden table. It was sealed tight with a heavy stamp of crimson wax. Her estate lawyer had pressed it firmly into my hands at the funeral reception just this morning, hours before my flight back to Boston. I stared at the red wax seal. The quiet melancholy and deep reflection that had settled over me just moments ago vanished completely, replaced by an Arctic, hardened resolve. Victoria and Julian thought they had outsmarted me. They believed their meticulous plan had left me destitute, homeless, and broken. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They forgot that I was raised by the most vicious corporate shark on the entire East Coast. My eyes narrowed, cold and decisively sharp, as my fingers broke the wax seal, fully ready to navigate the hidden minefield they had so foolishly laid down. At exactly 9 o'clock the following morning, I walked into the sprawling, glass-walled conference room of a premier downtown law firm. The air conditioning was set painfully low, smelling of lemon polish, expensive leather, and raw intimidation. The environment was specifically designed to make the opposing party feel small, isolated, and completely powerless. Victoria was already seated at the absolute center of the massive mahogany table, effectively claiming the position of absolute power. She wore a sharp ivory designer suit, her posture rigid and victorious. Spread out before her were dozens of pages of legal documents, specifically aggressive asset waiver forms. "Sit down, Haley," she commanded, not bothering to offer a polite greeting or even a fake expression of sympathy. She tapped a manicured fingernail against the top page of the thick stack. "I have instructed our attorneys to make this separation process as painless and efficient as possible. You must understand, marriage is a fragile economic ecosystem. When a woman fails to provide the proper nurturing environment for her husband's grand ambitions, she cannot act surprised when he seeks to protect his hard-earned assets." She paused, leaning forward to deliver her twisted lecture with maximum impact. "Women today really need to learn how to accept their shifting circumstances gracefully instead of fighting the inevitable. You should actually be counting your blessings this morning. Julian generously agreed to let you keep the four-door sedan. A less forgiving man would have left you walking to the bus stop. Sign the papers, take your little car, and quietly start over somewhere more appropriate for your station." Julian was sitting at the far end of the long table, shrinking into his oversized leather chair. He looked like a frightened child masquerading in a tailored corporate suit. He kept checking his heavy gold wristwatch, his knee bouncing rapidly up and down beneath the table, creating a pathetic, rhythmic tapping sound against the wood. "Please, Haley, just sign the waivers," Julian pleaded, his voice trembling with that familiar cowardly whine I had grown to despise. "We need to finalize this today. My venture capital investors are getting extremely anxious. I cannot have this messy divorce drama affecting the startup's quarterly projections. The board will pull my funding entirely if my personal finances are tied up in litigation. You always said you wanted my company to succeed. Prove it. Just sign it so we can all move on without destroying my career." I sat perfectly still, letting their absurd, twisted logic wash over me. Less than 24 hours ago, I would have been completely destroyed by their coordinated cruelty. But now I felt nothing but a thrilling, dangerous calm. I picked up the heavy silver pen Victoria had pushed across the table, rolling its cold metal casing slowly between my fingers, deliberately stretching out the agonizing silence. I watched Victoria's eyes track the pen, hungry for my signature, completely oblivious to the massive hurricane gathering right outside her pristine glass walls. Before the tip of my pen could even touch the paper, the heavy frosted glass doors of the conference room burst open with a forceful, violent thud. It sounded like a gunshot echoing through the quiet office. A tall man strode into the room. He did not knock, and he certainly did not ask for permission to enter. He was dressed in an immaculate charcoal black suit, carrying a monstrously thick leather portfolio under his arm. His expression was completely unreadable, his eyes sharp, analytical, and devoid of any human warmth. He exuded an aura of absolute authority that instantly sucked all the oxygen out of the room. "Good morning," the man announced, his deep voice commanding the space. "I am Mr. Vance. I serve as the chief legal counsel representing the private investment conglomerate that executed the purchase of the Boston property yesterday." Victoria's face instantly lit up. The smugness radiated visibly from her pores. She stood up so quickly, her heavy leather chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. She smoothed down her ivory jacket and extended her hand with a sickeningly sweet, triumphant smile. She clearly believed this imposing man was a vital business ally, the final piece of the puzzle, who had just flawlessly liquidated our marital assets and secured her ultimate financial victory. "Ah, Mr. Vance," Victoria cooed, oozing false charm and aristocratic grace. "It is an absolute pleasure. Your firm moved with incredible efficiency. We are just wrapping up the final loose ends with my former daughter-in-law right now. The timing of your arrival could not be more perfect." Mr. Vance stopped at the edge of the mahogany table. He looked down at Victoria's outstretched hand with terrifying indifference. He did not blink. He simply let her stand there, her hands suspended awkwardly in the frigid air, until the sheer embarrassment forced her to slowly lower it back to her side. Mr. Vance stepped past her and slammed the massive leather portfolio down onto the table. The heavy impact rattled Victoria's crystal water glass. "There are no loose ends to wrap up, ma'am," Mr. Vance stated, looking directly into Victoria's widening eyes. "I am not here to celebrate a successful transaction. I am here to serve official legal notice. As of midnight last night, the entire sale of the Boston property has been subject to an emergency federal freeze. Your transaction is completely dead." The suffocating silence that followed was absolute. Julian stopped bouncing his knee. His jaw dropped, all the color instantly draining from his face until he looked physically ill. Victoria sank slowly back into her chair, her arrogant composure shattering into 1,000 invisible pieces. The triumphant, untouchable atmosphere she had so carefully constructed only moments before was instantly annihilated, replaced by the freezing, paralyzing realization that the ground beneath their feet had just collapsed. Mr. Vance calmly unclasped the heavy brass locks of his leather portfolio. The sharp metallic clicks echoed like a judge's gavel in the painfully silent room. He withdrew a thick, professionally bound stack of documents and slid them deliberately across the polished mahogany table. They stopped exactly inches from Victoria's trembling hands. The corporate entity that initiated the purchase of the Boston property yesterday morning, Mr. Vance began, his voice cutting through the suffocating tension like a surgical blade, is a private holding subsidiary. It is entirely owned, funded, and managed by the Josephine Heritage Trust. Julian gasped loudly, his chest heaving as if he had just been submerged in freezing water. He gripped the edge of the heavy table so fiercely that his knuckles turned stark white. He knew exactly who Josephine was. Mr. Vance did not give them a single second to recover. He pulled out another document, this one bearing a bright red notary stamp, and laid it flat on the wood. Exactly 2 years ago, Julian Yu secured a massive commercial loan against the equity of the Boston Brownstone. You executed this maneuver to inject millions of dollars of emergency capital into your rapidly failing technology startup. However, because the property was jointly owned by your wife, you faced an insurmountable legal barrier. To bypass her required consent, you committed severe financial fraud. You intentionally forged Haley Morgan's signature on the primary mortgage authorization documents. Julian shrank violently into his chair, his eyes darting frantically toward the glass walls, searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. He looked physically sick, his earlier arrogance entirely replaced by the crushing weight of impending criminal charges. This sudden aggressive sale you orchestrated yesterday, Mr. Vance continued, pivoting his cold, analytical gaze directly onto Victoria, was never just a petty, greedy attempt to leave your daughter-in-law homeless. It was a desperate, highly calculated cover-up. You are a clever woman, Victoria. You realize that activating the divorce proceedings would automatically trigger a mandatory forensic audit of all marital assets by the family court. That audit would instantly expose your son's gross forgery. So you devised a rapid exit strategy. You intended to quickly liquidate the house, secretly pay off the fraudulent bank loan with the proceeds, and then hide the remaining cash in offshore accounts. You wanted to bury the evidence of the forged mortgage before the judge ever appointed an auditor. Victoria's face contorted into a horrifying mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The elegant, untouchable aristocrat who had been lecturing me about a woman's proper place just 10 minutes ago had completely vanished. She was now nothing more than a cornered, terrified animal caught in a steel trap. But your brilliant strategy contained one fatal miscalculation, Mr. Vance declared, his powerful voice leaving no room for argument. You incorrectly assumed the original bank still held your son's debt. They do not. Exactly 1 month ago, the late Josephine utilized her extensive corporate network to quietly investigate your highly suspicious financial filings. Once she uncovered the undeniable proof of the forgery, she did not alert the authorities. She chose a far more permanent solution. She went directly to the banking institution. Utilizing the massive capital of her trust, she purchased the entirety of Julian's bad debt. The Josephine Heritage Trust is now your sole, undeniable, and largest creditor. We own your loan. We hold the forged mortgage. And yesterday we disguised our subsidiary as the corporate buyer specifically to lure you into a legally binding frozen transaction. The sheer magnitude of the trap finally crushed the last remaining pillars of their fragile alliance. Victoria suddenly slammed her hands onto the table, her perfectly manicured nails scratching violently against the wood. She turned on her son with the vicious fury of a viper. "You absolute fool!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria, completely abandoning her refined persona. "I told you to run a full background check on the buyer. I told you to verify the corporate structure. How could you be so incredibly stupid to sell the house directly to her family?" Julian snapped. The years of pathetic subservience instantly evaporated, replaced by a desperate, ugly rage. He leaped out of his chair, knocking it backward onto the floor with a loud crash. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger right at his mother's face. "Don't you dare put this on me!" he roared, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "You were the one who swore this plan was absolutely foolproof. You are the one who stood in my private office exactly 2 years ago and demanded I forge her name. You handed me the pen. You told me it was a necessary risk to save the family legacy. I listened to you. I threw away my wife because of you, and now I am the one who will go to federal prison for bank fraud because of your insane, reckless greed." "I was trying to protect my investment in your worthless company," Victoria screamed back. Her face flushed dark red with fury, completely dismissing his impending ruin. "I am not the one who signed the fraudulent document, Julian. That is your signature on the line. You will take full responsibility for your own incompetence." I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, silently watching the glorious, chaotic destruction unfold. I did not need to raise my voice or lift a single finger. The impenetrable, flawless alliance that had tormented me, manipulated me, and drained my life for 15 long years was fracturing violently right before my eyes. They were viciously tearing each other to pieces, ready to throw their own flesh and blood to the wolves just to save themselves. It was a spectacular, breathtaking collision driven by the realization that their bottomless greed had just trapped them in an inescapable cage of their own making. Mr. Vance did not allow their vicious screaming match to echo against the glass walls for long. He simply reached out with one large hand and turned the heavy, crisp page of his leather-bound file. The harsh rustle of the thick paper sliced through their argument, instantly silencing the room. "If you are quite finished tearing each other apart," Mr. Vance stated, his voice a flat, booming baritone entirely devoid of any sympathy, "we should examine the forensic accounting of your technology firm's actual cash flow." Julian froze, his chest still heaving violently from his screaming fit. He wiped a cold bead of sweat from his forehead, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "What do you mean, the actual cash flow?" "The capital from the loan went directly into my company's operational accounts. It paid the developers. It kept the servers running." Mr. Vance slowly shook his head, his dark eyes locking onto Julian with a mixture of professional pity and absolute disdain. "That is merely what your heavily doctored internal ledgers reflect, Julian. However, when the holding company acquired your debt, we also subpoenaed the unfiltered banking routing numbers. They tell a drastically different, deeply tragic story." He tapped a glossy spreadsheet with his heavy pen, forcing Julian to step closer to the table. "When the funds from the forged mortgage finally cleared the bank 2 years ago, a massive lump sum was disbursed. But your struggling technology firm received barely a fraction of that money." Julian blinked rapidly, his face completely blank, the gears in his mind grinding to a painful halt. "No, that is simply impossible. I authorized the principal transfer myself. I saw the confirmation screen." "You authorized a transfer into a primary holding account, an account managed exclusively by your acting chief financial officer," Mr. Vance corrected him smoothly. "And who exactly has held total, unquestioned executive control over your financial department and asset management for the entirety of this enterprise?" The air in the room suddenly grew unimaginably heavy. Julian slowly, agonizingly turned his head. He looked directly at his mother. Victoria was no longer flushed with rage. All the color had violently drained from her face, leaving her skin an ashen, sickly gray. She pressed her lips together so tightly they practically disappeared. Mr. Vance delivered the fatal blow without a single ounce of mercy. Over 60% of the stolen equity from the Boston property never reached your company's servers or your employee payroll. It was systematically and quietly diverted, siphoned off through a highly complex web of anonymous shell corporations, and ultimately deposited into aggressive private venture capital funds located in various offshore tax havens. Funds that are registered, owned, and controlled solely under one single name: Victoria. The silence that followed was heavy, toxic, and absolutely deafening. Victoria swallowed hard, her throat clicking audibly in the quiet room. She took a tiny, pathetic step backward, raising her trembling hands in a defensive gesture. "Julian, darling, you have to understand." She stuttered, her normally smooth, aristocratic voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate whine. "Technology startups are incredibly volatile. Statistically, 90% of them fail within the first 5 years. I was just acting as a responsible safeguard. I was holding that money for you. I was keeping it safe in a separate portfolio just in case your little company actually collapsed." Julian looked as though he had been physically struck by a freight train. His knees finally gave out. He collapsed back into his fallen chair, letting it remain tipped on its side as he sat heavily on the floor. His hands shook violently as he grabbed his own hair, staring hollowly at the expensive carpet. The absolute crushing gravity of his reality had finally shattered his mind. This was the woman he worshipped. This was the brilliant, caring matriarch he had blindly followed for his entire life. To please her, he had emotionally abandoned a deeply loyal, fiercely intelligent wife who had literally worked herself to the bone to fund his fragile ego. He had committed a federal felony, risking his own freedom just to follow her financial advice. and in return his beloved mother had treated him as nothing more than a convenient expendable instrument. A foolish puppet she used to steal millions, fully expecting his life's work to fail. I sat in my chair perfectly still, silently watching this spectacular modern tragedy unfold. I did not shed a single tear for him. There was no sorrow in my heart, only a cold, profound sense of poetic justice. I finally understood that the cruelest, most agonizing punishment a person could endure was not losing a house or going bankrupt or facing a judge. The ultimate destruction was looking into the eyes of your own flesh and blood, your only remaining ally, and realizing they had been the parasite draining your life all along. Sensing the absolute death of her influence over her son, Victoria desperately clawed at the last remaining shreds of her fabricated dignity. She abruptly straightened her posture, desperately trying to summon back her arrogant aura. She glared at me, her eyes filled with poisonous hatred. "Fine!" Victoria hissed, her voice shaking with desperate malice. "Keep the ruined company. Take the worthless loan. It does not matter. You think you have won Haley, but you are nothing compared to me. I am still an incredibly wealthy woman. I still hold the deed to a massive multi-million-dollar estate in the Hamptons. I will liquidate it tomorrow if I have to. I will use every single penny from that mansion to hire the most vicious, ruthless defense attorneys on the Eastern Seaboard. I will tie you and your aunt's ridiculous trust fund up in litigation for the next 20 years until you are completely bankrupted by legal fees." Up until this exact moment, I had allowed them to command the room. I had sat silently and listened to their desperate threats, their vicious lies, and their frantic attempts to salvage their crumbling empire. But now, as Victoria brandished her precious Hamptons estate like a final impenetrable shield against her impending ruin, I finally broke my silence. I leaned forward in my heavy leather chair and smiled. It was not the quiet, restrained smile I had given them on the freezing porch yesterday afternoon. This was a radiant, razor-sharp smile of absolute, undeniable victory. I did not even bother looking at Victoria. Instead, I simply caught Mr. Vance's eye and gave him a single subtle nod, gesturing toward the very bottom of his massive leather portfolio. Mr. Vance understood perfectly. He bypassed the remaining glossy financial spreadsheets and pulled out a single aged document. It was slightly yellowed at the edges, distinctly older than the recent mortgage fraud files we had just reviewed. He laid it gently on the center of the mahogany table. "I highly doubt you will be hiring any elite defense attorneys with the equity from that estate, Victoria," I said, my voice echoing clearly and calmly across the room, "because you do not actually own it anymore." Victoria scoffed a harsh, jagged sound of pure denial, but her panicked eyes immediately flicked down to the yellowed paper resting on the table. "Exactly 7 years ago," Mr. Vance interjected, his tone authoritative and entirely definitive, "when your son desperately required initial seed capital to launch his technology firm, he found himself completely devoid of liquid assets. No bank would approve him. However, he did possess one highly valuable, unsecured tool. You had carelessly granted him broad, unlimited power of attorney to manage your estate finances while you were traveling abroad in Europe." Julian, who was still sitting on the floor amid his overturned chair, let out a pathetic, suffocated gasp. He pulled his trembling knees tightly to his chest, realizing the final, darkest secret of his entire life was about to be dragged into the merciless light. "Utilizing that legal authority," Mr. Vance continued relentlessly, "Julian secretly took out a massive secondary mortgage against your multi-million-dollar Hamptons property. He essentially used your beloved house as collateral to secretly fund his failing company." Victoria's mouth dropped open, but no sound came out. She looked as though she were physically suffocating on the dry, sterile air of the conference room. "But how does that affect the current situation?" She finally managed to whisper, her voice entirely stripped of its former aristocratic arrogance. "That mortgage is a completely separate legal entity." I stood up slowly from my chair, making absolutely sure she watched my every deliberate movement. "Because of a standard legal clause known as cross-default," I explained, simplifying the complex corporate law my Aunt Josephine had taught me over the years. When a borrower holds multiple major loans with a single entity committing a catastrophic default on one, automatically triggers a massive default on all the others. When you forced Julian to illegally sell the Boston house yesterday, and when you aggressively initiated the divorce proceedings to cover your dirty tracks, you officially violated the terms of the commercial mortgage. Mr. Vance delivered the final devastating judgment. The Josephine Heritage Trust is now the primary lien holder for both of those debts. Because the cross-default clause was automatically triggered at midnight last night, we have officially initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings on all available collateral to offset your massive debt. We are legally seizing the technology firm, its remaining offshore assets, and the Hamptons estate. Everything is gone. Victoria collapsed heavily back into her chair. Her face turned completely white, resembling a cold, lifeless marble statue. She was utterly speechless, entirely paralyzed by the horrific realization that her own malicious actions had sealed her total doom. By locking me out in the cold and demanding this aggressive divorce, she had personally lit the match that burned her entire aristocratic dynasty to the ground. Julian remained completely motionless on the floor, a broken, empty shell of a man. In less than 24 hours, he had lost his fiercely loyal wife, the mother he worshipped blindly his entire corporate career, and he was now burdened with an astronomical mountain of debt he could never possibly repay in this lifetime. I looked down at the divorce papers still sitting on the table, completely unsigned. I did not need to sign them today. My massive legal team would handle the miserable ruins they left behind. I calmly adjusted the lapels of my winter coat, picked up my leather purse, and walked confidently toward the frosted glass doors. I did not offer them a single word of goodbye. They did not deserve another second of my time. I pushed open the heavy doors of the firm and stepped out onto the busy downtown sidewalk. The blinding winter storm from yesterday had entirely cleared, leaving behind a brilliant, glorious afternoon sun that reflected brightly off the melting snow. The air was crisp, fresh, and tasted like absolute freedom. I raised my hand and hailed a passing yellow taxi. I gave the driver the address for the international airport. I was heading to a peaceful, quiet coastal town up in Maine, ready to breathe the fresh ocean air and start a completely new life. I left behind the towering skyscrapers of Boston, and I happily left behind the monsters who had successfully dug their own graves, entirely consumed by their bottomless, unquenchable greed. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Haley Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.